Right. Well, welcome everyone to the February installment of the IPM Hour. Today we have Doug Johnson with us presenting, who is currently the Executive Director for the California Invasive Plant Council. He holds bachelor's and master's degrees, both in engineering from UC Davis and Stanford, and a master's degree in geography from San Francisco State University. Doug has been really active in ecological conservation and sustainability in California over his career. He worked as the Energy Conservation Project Manager for the City and County of San Francisco. He's also a founding member of the California Horticultural Invasives Prevention Partnership and the Plant Right Partnership, and currently serves as the treasurer for the National Association of Invasive Plant Councils. I hope I have all that right. And today he's going to talk to us about IPM decision support tools for wildland weed management.
Well, I very much appreciate the invite today. I was looking through some of the other talks that have been given by a number of experts, and I am more of a generalist, but I do have some interesting information to share today on decision support tools for wildland weed management. I am, as Matt said, with the California Invasive Plant Council, or Cal-IPC or Cal-IPC. We are a nonprofit organization. We celebrated our 30th anniversary last year. Spent the first 10 years of the organization's life as an all-volunteer organization. So it's still very much the board is a working board, and we support a very active community of land managers working in wildlands. A quick look at our homepage to give you a sense for who we are. Protecting California's environment and economy from invasive plants is our mission. And we do a couple things. We provide resources for land managers, but we also help to coordinate projects across the state when a landscape level coordinator is needed. So for instance, there are several pictures here on our homepage of some of our projects. From the left is a new weed in the Borrego Springs area, Voluteria tubuliflora, which we are hoping to get Wildlife Conservation Board funding, not us, but a local partner, to contain and control before it spreads across the desert Southwest. But these are some volunteers that actually were the first ones to identify it and start working on it. We had a Sierra Nevada Meadows project to identify climate change refugia and how invasive plants might affect those. And then in San Francisco Bay, the invasive Spartina project has been funded by the Coastal Conservancy and others for close to 20 years at this point to control invasive hybrids there. And this is actually a bird expert looking for clapper rail, ridgeways rail, which are one of the endangered species that use the marsh and that we have to work around when doing work out there. Resources that Cal-IPC offers, we have our inventory, which is basically the default list of invasive plants in California. We have a library of books, reports, videos. We have web pages for each of the state's weed management areas. If you're not familiar, they're typically county-based collaboratives that bring together all stakeholders who are managing invasive plants in wildlands. We have archives of 30 years worth of symposium talks and newsletter articles. And we have Cal Weed Mapper, which we'll see in a moment, which is one of the decision support tools that we offer. We have an annual conference every October. This year, I think it's going to be in early November to kind of miss the Native Plant Society conference. Last year's was our 30-year anniversary, as I mentioned. And we met online for the second time in a row, and we had something like 700 attendees, which was a lot for us. Usually in person, which moves around the state, was going to be at Chico State University 2 years ago before it got moved online. Usually we'll have about 350 people. It's in person, it's typically 3 days. Online, it's been 4 days with presentations and discussion groups and trainings and poster sessions and that kind of thing, field trips. And these are just some of the settings in case you're not focused on wildland weed management. These are some of the challenging settings that people work in and some of the types of weeds that people are working on. In the top left, we have some of the Spartina work in the mud in, in San Francisco Bay. I think of, you hear about Eskimos having lots of words for different types of snow. I think they have lots of words for different types of mud because it's quite a challenging environment to work in. Next to that are some UC Davis researchers, actually USDA, I think, and UC Davis working on water hyacinth. Over at the far right, I think it's a state parks staffer working on broom. In the center on the bottom is a private landowner, a rancher working on some star thistle, yellow star thistle, and woolly distaff thistle. And on the bottom left, I believe that's a CAL FIRE crew, but guided by a county agricultural commissioner's office working on a rundo down in San Benito County. So we work with volunteers, we work with county ag, we work with state and local and federal land management agencies and private landowners as well. Okay, so let's talk about decision support. There are a lot more weeds out there than there's time to work on, of course, and so strategy is essential. And so there are three major kinds of support that that we offer. One is which weed species are the highest priority, and that's where the inventory, the list of weeds comes in terms of ranking their impacts based on potential for environmental impact and also for spread. A lot of the weeds are not as widespread across the state as they will be. So where are they at in that trajectory? And then the pre-tool, which stands for plant, my spacing on that, plant risk evaluator. It's underlined because that's one of the ones we're going to talk about today. And that's a predictive tool to look at weeds that will become potentially have a high risk of potentially becoming invasive in the future. So along with which weed species, you need to know where to work on them. And so that's a spatial question, and that's where Cal Weed Mapper, which I mentioned a moment ago, comes in. And we'll take a quick one slide look at that before moving on. But there are various spatial strategies that we work with partners on. One could be asset protection. If you've got an area with endangered species and you want to really protect it, you might keep that in very good condition, while outside the boundaries of that area, you're much less concerned about weeds. But in general, we're looking at early action and trying to contain weeds that are just getting started from spreading, usually known weeds in a new area, trying to identify them early and get on top of them, which sounds really easy, but in fact, it's challenging because we're much more programmed to see the big problem in front of us and be trying to deal with that. And the new things that are just coming in may not even be detected. And if they're detected, their relevance may not be immediately grasped. And then how do you actually go after, if you've identified something as a target, what's the best way to control it? And so I've underlined weed cut here. That's the other tool that we will talk about in more detail today. So a quick look just at Cal Weed Mapper. This is just a screenshot, so there's no functionality to play with here, but there are several things one can do. You can select a specific species. So here, Russian knapweed has been selected, and there's a map of California that has several kinds of spatial data displayed. One is actual population locations directly from CalFlora. CalFlora is an online database that absorbs GIS data sets from partners, as well as takes a lot of individual observations, kind of like before iNaturalist existed, CalFlora was doing that. And now iNaturalist is doing it, and that's one of our challenges, is to make sure that we skim relevant data from iNaturalist, from amateur observers typically, and get it into CalFlora, because CalFlora is kind of the database of record for us in tracking invasive plants at the landscape scale. So those are the dots. The rectangles are USGS quads that are shaded based on expert knowledge. We had in 2011 and 12, we had some federal stimulus funding through the Forest Service, which enabled us not only to build the tool, but to conduct over 100 meetings statewide with local experts to collect their expert knowledge on several hundred plants at the coarse USGS quad level. Presence absence mostly, but a little bit more than that. Is it spreading? Kind of where is it on the invasion curve? Is it being managed? Those kind of things. So it's a fair amount of data in here for each plant. Some of them also have, as mentioned here in the legend, suitable range data. I think about 40% of them we were able to model both range currently, so based on where the plant occurs now in California, using climatic factors, where else it could grow in California, based on those climatic factors, and using that as a tool to help understand where you might need to be wary of it moving in if it's not there already. But then we also looked at a number of global circulation models and modeled the suitable range climatically under those scenarios. And so looked for areas where plants their suitability would be decreasing significantly or their suitability would be increasing significantly. Another major thing you can do in Cal Weed Mapper is select a particular region. So you might say, hey, I want to look at my county, or I want to look at this national park. There are a lot of different regions already programmed into this, and it will tell you which plants are present but at a low level within that region. So those may be eradication targets. It'll tell you which plants are not in the region but are nearby. So those could be surveillance targets, things like that. So no more on spatial prioritization, but that's certainly a major factor. Many of you are likely familiar with the typical invasion curve, where something comes in and the amount of it is small, and then it may take a while to establish, and then it may take a while in a lag phase to actually start expanding, but then it can expand rapidly until it's become widespread. These are a couple examples from California agriculture, where yellow star thistle, in terms of millions of acres infested, really took off in the latter part of the last century. Detrichia graveolens, we have a new Detrichia to worry about now. Stinkwort took off, this is the number of counties, really took off starting 20 years ago. And if we had gotten on it 20 years ago, maybe there was something we could have done. So the point here being that early detection, of course, is important, but predicting which things are going to be problematic. So we have lots of non-native plants that are naturalized, established in the California wildlands that aren't necessarily spreading. So it's hard to know how much concern to have about them. We had a long list of species that had been basically nominated by land managers as things they'd seen in wildlands they were mildly concerned about and wanted to know how much of a concern to have. So the pre-tool is designed to be predictive. Now, it wasn't originally designed for the purpose of looking at plants that have established in wildlands and wondering how big a problem they might be. It was initially organized and put together through the Plant Right Partnership, which is something that Cal IPC has been very involved in, as well as the nursery industry, other environmental nonprofits, agencies, and universities, with the goal of preventing introductions through horticulture. And so this was developed initially as a screening tool for nurseries to use as they're prospecting new plants to potentially bring in, that they can responsibly gauge whether, wow, this could be a problem. We should be aware of that. But we quickly saw from our angle that the same tool could be useful for gauging which plants that were already established in California's wildlands were at highest risk of becoming an invasive problem in the future. And so it's by tool, I mean a protocol with 20 questions that then produce a score, and that score puts the plant into a category. If the score is high enough, the plant is high risk. If the score is low enough, it's low risk. And there's an in-between section where it's indeterminate. And so we ran through Cal IPC, had a grant, I think that was also through the Forest Service, to run through some 200 plant species to determine which, actually it wasn't 200, anyway, a number of plant species, I think it was more like 80, to determine which were potentially high risk and which were low risk. And we came out with, I think about 45 to 50% of them as high risk, and then included those in our inventory as so-called watch species. So they aren't invasive like our other species on the inventory. They are at high risk of becoming invasive in the future. So we'll talk a little bit more about how that can be used. I did want to mention that we, in this last calendar year, with a grant from the Western IPM Center, worked with partners in Washington, Oregon, and Arizona to train them up on using the tool and to start kind of selecting plants that are a priority in their states to assess in a predictive sense to see whether they're at a high risk of becoming invasive in the future. And that was kind of a mix between plants that are in horticulture, but already being used locally, and just plants that are found in wildlands. So that's been a really good project, both for on the predictive sense, but also for developing and strengthening our relationships with partners in neighboring states. So I want to leave the slideshow here momentarily and take a look at the PRE website. I thought it would be a little bit more instructive than trying to look at screenshots. So PRE is basically only available currently through having a login, which can be obtained, but it's still, there are still vestiges of its original development for nursery partners where it needed to be fairly private so that nursery partners could keep their proprietary information to themselves. So there is both kind of a public end and a private end here. But I'm going to log in, and we can pick, I don't know, let's try Acacia baeliana. So this, I'm going to scroll down. As you can see, there's a kind of a listing here. This is, let me go to the actual evaluation. So this is the evaluation with some 20 questions, and you obviously can't read it at the rate I'm going, but the point being, you know, you can kind of get a sense for the scale. And I will take a look at a few questions, but the overall, like if we look here on the right, the summary is that its total score came out to be 22, which is high risk. In the original usage, that would be telling a nursery, hey, this is high risk, be pretty cautious about developing it as a horticultural commodity. From our usage, it tells us, hey, we would classify this as a watch species. The number of questions answered helped determine kind of the validity of the evaluation. The confidence is calculated based on an average of all the questions. And this is made public by Calypsy. And so there is a growing database of evaluations here. And so we hope to keep working with Oregon, Washington, and Arizona, and ideally other partners to increase the database of assessments here, because if it's assessed in one place, it's relatively easy to take that assessment and repurpose it for another place. There are questions here that are place specific, of course. And those are some of the most important. If we look at the beginning, so we see here, there is a climate matching map, and we'll talk about that in a second, but some of the first questions, and ones that get a fair amount of points, are, has this species become naturalized where it's not native? Has it become naturalized in a similar climate? And then there are more questions down below about being invasive. So A, can it actually spread outside of its normal native range? 2, can it spread outside its normal range in a range that's like California's? And then we start to get more into, has it been invasive? What kind of impacts does it cause? What, some factors about its reproductive capability, that kind of thing. And so because that, that comparison of, well, how has it behaved in other areas similar to ours is so important, There is a climate tool that has been developed to go with this, and we're looking at revamping it. But you can either search by states or by ecoregions. But basically, if we say California, so California is selected here, this map is telling us, and we can actually see globally, but it's telling us where else in the world matches the parameters, and I believe it's precipitation, an ecozone, like a global ecozone rating, and I'd have to look on the homepage. There are three different layers. Let's see, data layer, hardiness zones. Yeah, hardiness zones, precipitation, and ecozones. So those three combined, if you take any, I can't remember how big the grid cell is in California, but if where else in the world matches any of the grid cells in California, and there may be a threshold, like it has to match at least, 0.1% of the state or something like that. But so this is telling us that there are places across the Western US that look like at least part of California. If you want to get more specific, you can go down to an eco region. But then, it's showing us the Mediterranean, South Africa, the Mediterranean, some Australia, et cetera. So it's that's a very useful tool, given that we now have through GBIF and other international databases more information on the distribution of these weeds across the world. So you can compare and say, hey, well, this weed does grow in Portugal. Therefore, yes, we're going to call it a climate match. So that's kind of the basics. Those are the basics for the pre-tool. And you can see there are links here to the sources. So there is a whole bibliography section, so that this is meant to be fairly well documented, where the answers come from. And the production of the ratings is done by a draft reviewer and then, or an evaluator, and then there are expert reviewers that will look that over and kind of certify it. And we like to have one reviewer from kind of just a general science background, academia, one reviewer from a conservation background, and one reviewer from a horticultural background, in part because often these plants have some horticultural use, and we want there to be both an expert and somebody who kind of represents the industry to weigh in and say, yes, this looks okay to me. You're not going off the deep end and being, too overly cautious and saying that this is a problem plant when it's not. So let me go back to the PowerPoint here. So I mentioned that the plants that rate high risk end up in our inventory as watch plants. And this really is meant to help land managers work earlier on the invasion curve. So they're alerted to keep an eye on these plants if they have them in areas they're managing, to really observe what's going on with them, and then to make sure to report it if they see something. So it's a little bit of a heightened alert. And if you're in the fortunate enough place to have enough resources to go beyond your obvious control targets and to go for something extra, you may want to go ahead and control that plant species, just to be safe. And these watch species are now mapped in CalWeedMapper as well. So one can look at their distribution and have a sense for whether they don't have the range modeling on there at this point, but one can get a sense for whether they're nearby and potentially something to keep an eye on. Oops. Okay, I think that was just a duplicate slide. So a bit of an intermission here before going on to the second decision support tool, just to take a quick look at a few pictures, since that's a little bit more interesting, at least to me, to see some of the weed work going on around the state. This is a project on knotweeds up in Humboldt and Del Norte County that we partnered on, and some of the strategic decisions here involve kind of spatially just looking at the continental distribution of knotweeds. They're a huge problem in Washington and in Oregon, but just coming into the northern part of California. So it made a lot of sense to focus on trying to get what's there currently now and then to try to keep it out. And that's also the place in California where the climate is most suitable for it, although we do have some here in the Bay Area as well. And the second tool I'm going to talk about, weed cut, is about how do you go after a plant, and certainly knotweeds are one of the most difficult plants to control. And Humboldt County, for instance, is a place where using herbicides is not usually is usually frowned upon, and knotweeds are a plant that's extremely difficult to control without herbicides. So that took some coordination between partners from from Washington and Northern California to understand what the trade-offs were. Arundodonax, or giant reed, is a problem in waterways across California. And one of the main challenges to getting large grants to control it at the watershed level is having the mapping data available to plan those projects and figure out how much it's going to cost, and to also calculate the impact of that arundo, for instance, on flow conveyance. If it's like a Prop 1 grant, that's their main focus. So you can see some of the field mapping going on here and some of the GIS that's produced from that. And then again, the work around San Francisco Bay, the limonium is invasive sea lavender. The Spartina has been going for 20 years. It's a huge project. It's like a $2.5 million a year project. While folks were out there, another new weed was spotted, actually two of them, two limonium species, invasive sea lavender. And good news is it's not a hybrid. It's not down in the mud as much. It's easier to get to, and there were only 16 total acres of it found across San Francisco Bay at 80 some odd locations. But this was spotted because there were people out working in marshes, and it was able to be mapped because there were people who were already skilled with getting out to marshes. And so we have had several years of funding through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to have crews go out and control it. And we don't know how long the seed bank is, but we've seen like over 90% reduction at some of the sites where we've controlled for multiple years. So that's good news. But as a new weed, it also took some doing to figure out what the appropriate control approach was, which herbicide to use when in places where we could use herbicide, how many treatments a year, how many visits a year were necessary to prevent seed set, that kind of thing. And then I mentioned the Voluteria down in Borrego Springs. The top map, the small maps on the left, that's from a screenshot from CalFlora, but you can see just how concentrated this population is. And we really don't want it to escape and start spreading, but there's a fair amount of it there too. And then the lower map is a screenshot from that pre-climate application we were just looking at. And in this case, we used it to project, well, given that the Voluteria grows in this ecoregion here, there also are a couple of smaller populations along the coast. So we selected those two ecoregions. What else looks like that climatically? And so these green areas show potentially where it could spread to if it's not contained. So that's pretty scary. And this is a volunteer holding a Voluteria plant and a Saharan mustard plant. So let's talk about that other strategy, how to control a given plant, and not only a given plant, but in a given situation. And this is a project that was funded by the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, and that we worked heavily extensively with the UC IPM program to build the web interface. So the first effort, and I guess I'll start here, is on treatment best management practices. And so that is, one of the things that CalIPSI has struggled with / filled the need for over the years, is that a lot of the information is in experts' minds. It hasn't made its way into reference materials yet. And so we pulled together a whole crew, I think it was 60 different experts from across the state, a lot of cooperative extension, et cetera, and aggregated their information to generate best management practices that also took into account different caveats. So to say, well, this will work, but in this situation it won't. You need to know that. So we tried to flesh these out fairly thoroughly. And then the Weed Cut web tool is built on top of the information for these best management practices, but it helps the user find the best information. So we'll talk about that in a second. So the first part was data collection, and there was a baseline practitioner survey that Cheryl Willen with UC IPM program had done, and you can't see all the details with these pie charts, but basically surveying land managers to say, well, given different kinds of weeds, and this is just a partial table of the pie charts, but given the different kinds of weeds and a whole bunch of different kinds of methods, how effective do you find them? And so that was a very useful starting point. And then we conducted workshops in Northern California and Southern California to collect expert information there, and then compiled this best management practices manual. Now you'll notice it's best management practices for non-chemical weed control. So that was the grant we had from DPR, was to compile strictly non-chemical methods. And that was driven in part by the growing frequency of agencies being constrained in terms of what tools they can use in their weed control. I think of the Marin Municipal Water District, where they work on a lot of broom and other plants, having their management decide, hey, we aren't going to use herbicides for now. We're going to have a temporary ban on herbicides. So it was definitely an important thing to make sure both that land managers knew the best ways to use non-chemical methods, and that the limits or the effectiveness of non-chemical methods and the costs of non-chemical methods are fairly understood. So that can be planned for. So there were 21 different techniques, and we'll take a look at those in a second, and 60 experts who helped flesh those out. And then partners from USDA Agricultural Research Service and CDFA, the California Department of Food and Ag, fleshed out a whole section on biocontrols for 20 different weeds. So there is a PDF online for download of this. We did print a few copies, but not many. It's mostly meant to be a PDF. But then the web tool is developed, as I mentioned, on top of that. And this is just a view of the homepage. But what's most useful about the tool, and I think I have a slide coming up that will show some of the boxes where the user enters their information. But if I have a particular type of plant and a particular situation that I can enter information on, the Weed Cut tool, I mean, I almost think of it as like going to Zappos and looking for shoes or something. You say, I want something brown and I want it in this size, and I want this general type, and it filters it down for you. Weed Cut will take the parameters about the type of plant you're working on and the type of situational site characteristics you have, and generate or filter the list of those 21 approaches down to the ones that are going to be most effective. So those 21 approaches, so biological control, burning, competitive planting, cutting with hand tools, cutting with chainsaws, cutting with pruners, loppers, shears, and hand saws, and cutting with string trimmers or brush cutters, flaming, which is not burning, but more like, was the term steaming almost, although we have steaming in here as well. You're bursting cells, girdling, grazing, grub hose, tillage, mowing, mulching, scraping, severing roots, solarizing, steaming, stump grinding, tarping, whole plant removal by hand, and whole plant removal using large equipment. And so the user enters information, as I mentioned, on the type of plant. We actually have, so we have a follow-up project. I didn't mention that. We do have a second DPR grant to now add information on techniques with herbicides. And I'll get to that in a moment. But as part of that second grant, we also, I believe, will add just kind of a pick list of specific plants as opposed to having to define the plant type. But currently the way it is, you define the plant type, whether it's a perennial, it's woody, some of its reproductive characteristics. And then you provide site characteristics. So we have level of tolerable disturbance. So, you know, can you run roughshod over this place with a tractor or, you know, backhoe, or is it like sensitive habitat? How big is your area? How accessible is the area? What type of habitat is it? What's the ground condition like? What's the slope like? How much of the invasive plant is there? And how much of desirable vegetation is there? So by selecting those and your plant type, WeedCut is going to filter for the control techniques that are deemed most effective for those applications. And that's done by basically having a big matrix on the back end, a big spreadsheet table where those 60 experts went through and rated, okay, this method for this type of plant, for this situation, you know, here's basically how effective it's gonna be. And the efficacy ratings were, excuse me, based on expert opinion, and expert opinion of single season reduction in cover and propagule reduction for that technique and that site condition. And there's a range of excellent being control greater than 95%, good 80 to 95%, fair, et cetera, stepping down. And I'd have to say from my use of the tool, very, very infrequently do I get some excellent or even good option. So here's an example where a whole bunch of, I checked off a bunch of different parameters for the plants and the site conditions. And this first go here, I was thinking of, say, a broom, so a woody perennial with, let's see, where is the resprout? Yeah, rate of spread is high. I thought there was a flowering, resprouting. Yeah, resprouting capacity high. So anyway, with all these factors, broom in an area where it could be disturbed, we came out with chainsaws and grazing and whole plant removal with large equipment. Notice that those are fair results, 50 to 80% control, which is pretty darn good actually, but nothing came out in the good category or the excellent category. By changing a couple of parameters, making it a little less likely to resprout, so I made it moderate, and let's see, so we reduced the area, so less of it, and reduced the resprouting, and then reduced the level of tolerable disturbance. So saying, well, no, we can't run roughshod over this. Let's see if on the back one, level of tolerable disturbance is high. You can disturb it, don't worry about it. Whereas this one, the level of tolerable disturbance was lowered to medium. So you can see that the results came out. We still have chainsaw, we still have grazing, we don't have the large equipment, but now we've got brush cutters, which I would have thought of kind of as the first option to go get a bunch of broom, but I guess maybe only when it's 2 acres as opposed to 40 acres or whatever the choices were. Severing roots, well, maybe. We've said it's less capable of resprouting. And whole plant removal. So yeah, you might go in there with a weed wrench or something. So that's just a taste for how it will return proposed methods. Now you can, I can see if my next slide is pointing to this. No. So any of these, then you would click on them and you could drill down and find out, how do I do this? What are the caveats for this? What are the costs for this? It's a whole range of information, the BMP information that will help you sort out the pros and cons of using that, as well as some ratings for, yeah, well, this is, you know, this is a 3-star or a $3 restaurant kind of thing. These are the 20 species that we have biocontrol information on. So again, you can drill down to each of these and get very detailed information on using these biocontrols or using biocontrols for these plants. There may be multiple agents for each plant. So yes, we are adding herbicides to this tool, and basically the primary effort will be taking the information in this weed control manual published through UCANR almost a decade ago at this point, and updating things. So we are working with cooperative extension experts who can say, yeah, we've had some new chemicals approved and that kind of thing. So we'll integrate both the chemicals and the techniques into weed cut, and ideally we'll be able to integrate since you're often using a non-chemical method with a chemical method, integrated approach. We'll be working on the best ways to have the tool recommend those to the user. So wrapping up, just a reminder that the pre-tool is currently not available for public use, and the outputs aren't even publicly available, but we are working on that. We're talking to UC IPM and others about possible ways to move forward with the pre-tool. Weed cut is for practitioners to use. The URL is here. I mean, it needs a https:// in front of it, but that is definitely there to use. Please do. It's a living system. We'll be developing it with the herbicide element next. We'd love to have any feedback on it. Cal Weed Mapper, of course, is also for practitioner use, although in reality, it ends up often being Calypsy working with regional partners to develop a regional strategy where it really comes in. But there are a lot of questions one can answer there as well for whatever region you're interested in. So that's the overview I have. Feel free to reach out to me, of course. And Calypsy's URL is there as well if you want to take a look at some of the resources we have, or find out about our conference this fall.
Thanks, Doug. That's terrific. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat currently. If folks would like to ask questions, you can either take your mics off mute and ask your question, or you can type your question in the chat. So I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question. You mentioned that the pre-tool is targeted. Well, I don't know if it's targeted, but it can be used by nurseries to inform them about what they might choose to produce. But I guess I was wondering about some of the larger retailers who are going to be purchasing these plants from the nurseries, and whether or not those might also be, folks that might be able to use these tools. Because even if we say restrict the production of some of these plants, it seems like if the larger retailers are still intent on getting a hold of those, they probably still can.
Yeah, working at the production end and the retail end are both things that the PlantRight partnership has worked on over the years. In terms of things that are already on the shelf, the PlantRight partnership has a commitment to be all voluntary and not to raise the R word regulation. So it's about education and voluntary action, and so there is a list of plants that are in the trade that the whole partnership, so Calypsy's opinion is in there, but also the nursery trade and agencies, et cetera, have decided we'd like to recommend people not buy those and not sell those. And so that's mostly where the rubber hits the road in terms of recommendations to both the retailers and the shoppers. And in terms of, there is an active plant list committee through PlantRight that meets regularly to discuss, hey, should we add more things to this? Right. But it's a fairly conservative list, because there is especially when you're looking at a place as varied as California, a desire not I mean, as much as maybe from the Calypsy narrow perspective, we might say, hey, let's, anything that has a risk, let's not use it. That's not realistic. And so, maintaining plants in the trade, unless they really can be shown to be problematic, is kind of where we're at now.
So we do have a question in the chat from Len Coop, and he asks, is the climate match part of pre, or wait, is the climate match part of pre, or does it import that from other tools? So is that climate match a piece of the pre program? And then how does the climate matching operate?
Great. So the climate match, the way it currently works, well, so the use of the climate match, we'll get into how it's generated in a second, but the use of it is currently the person doing the review for plant X has to look at the map that app shows of where else in the world looks like California, and then they need to look at a map like from GBIF, the Global Biological Information Facility or something, but basically a database of distribution of plants or organisms across the globe, and they need to look for overlap and say, yep, I see on that map that this plant is growing there, and I see on this map that that place looks suitable to California. One of our next steps in trying to build that climate matching tool is to basically import the GBIF data and overlay it, so it's much easier to tell where there's a confluence of factors. But it's not, it doesn't automatically go into the pre-tool. The person doing the review in the pre-tool basically needs to go and look and see, is there a match? And then go back to the pre-tool and say, yes, there is a match. And here is a PDF of the maps showing that match. In terms of the how the tool works, it's taking those three factors, the precipitation, the ecozone, and the hardiness zone, and overlaying them. And so taking grid cells throughout the world, I can't remember how small they are, but taking the combination of those factors for, I don't know if it's the centroid of those cells or how the data is configured when it goes in, but they basically picked a grid cell that would work for each of those three layers and said, okay, what is the combination of those three factors in that grid cell? And then that's kind of the code for that type of grid cell. It's got it's in the precipitation band of 20 to 30 inches a year, and it's in this ecozone and it's in this hardiness zone. Boom, that's its combination. And then it looks for any other grid cells, excuse me, that match that combination throughout the world.
All righty. We have a follow-up question from Len. So the GCM prediction can only use plant hardiness and precipitation, as who can predict climate zone change?
If I understand correct, well, a couple things. So it includes three factors. One is the global ecozone that I think comes from the UN. But yeah, great question. These are based on current data sets. And one of the needs is to be able to extrapolate into the future, which is not super accurate or known, but should be attempted anyway. We did do some of that in Cal Weed Mapper, where I think we had 17 different models, and a certain number of them had to match and say, yes, this area is suitable, in order for us to say, okay, that's suitable. And those models were based on bioclimatic data throughout California. Now, fortunately, we did that because we had funding, but fortunately, a lot of others are doing that, including the USGS out of Fort Collins, I believe. We've been seeing presentations on their Inhabit tool, where they are doing range extrapolations based on existing data. The future range extrapolations, those are tricky, but those are starting to happen more. And so as those become available off the shelf, that can be included in this as well. And so if we are trying to, for instance, use the pre-tool to say, okay, well, here's a plant that's growing in California, doesn't seem to be spreading. We want to know how big a risk it is of becoming invasive in the future. We can look at, we would ideally be able to look at not just how suitable is California currently, but how suitable is California in the future, or different parts of California. So we're getting to that point, but it's we're a lot closer than we used to be. It used to be like the idea, like, hey, we can see where else this grows in the world and see if what that tells us about it growing here, but the data wasn't available either climate-wise or where else it grows in the world. They might say, yeah, it grows in China. That's not specific enough. So yeah, data is getting better and better, and then the routes to using that data to coming up with relatively useful projections is getting better and better.
Right. So Steve Young has a question, and he asks, it would be good to know who and how many are using it. And I presume he's referring to both tools, but maybe it's just one or the other.
Yeah, or all three. We get asked from the Forest Service, so how many people are using Cow Weed Mapper that we helped you build?
Right.
And it's not a huge impressive number of people coming to the site and using it, but it's extremely useful for us in planning regional strategy with agencies. So in terms of there are a fair number of people from the first push to have nursery partners use it who have used it, often like botanic gardens or other horticultural interests that have time, not a ton of nurseries. And then in terms of folks like Calypsy, we're probably the largest single user of it because we did have that grant to run a whole bunch of plants through it. And now that we've been working with Oregon and Washington and Arizona, there are several partners for each of those states who are starting to use it as well. I don't have those. I probably should have looked to say how many plant assessments are there and how many are public, et cetera. Hopefully it won't be too long before all that material, or at least the material that should be available for public, we're willing to make it available for the public, is available. And then the tool itself is as well. On weed cut, I think UC IPM is currently actually doing a survey of folks to find out how many people are using it and how they're using it and what kind of feedback they have. So not a very accurate answer, but that's what I know.
Yeah, so just a follow up, if they build it, they will come.
Well, we've learned from experience that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes it's a lot easier to build a technical tool than it is to get people who are super busy to use the darn thing. So having the outreach and engaging people and making sure that it's actually, the workflow is something that's useful to people is pretty important.
Right. Okay. I think that might be it for questions. I'm not seeing any more come through the chat, and I don't see anybody with their hand raised. So I think that might be it for questions. All right. Well, thanks, Doug. Really appreciate it. That was great. That was a great presentation. I just want to remind everyone that our next IPM Hour is coming up in March on the 9th. Yeah, the 9th at noon Pacific. And I think Steve, I think we already have speakers. I know you sent a list and I tried to find it while Doug was talking, but I couldn't.
It's in the newsletter. We have speakers out through June, and the next month is Andy Melitopoulos from Oregon State on pollinators and IPM.
Great. So thank you everyone for joining today, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.